The man's voice was like gravel scraped from a dry creek bed. "Let me have a taste." It wasn't a question. In the thin, hungry air of Redemption Creek's makeshift mess hall, it was a demand, thick with the casual authority of a man used to taking what he wanted. Lynn's hands, which had been deftly portioning out the steaming noodles and broth into a chipped ceramic bowl, went still. She didn't look up. Not yet. She kept her eyes on the swirl of fragrant steam, a small, private world she had conjured in the heart of this frozen, hostile land. The dark red of her dress was the only spot of deep color in the room of faded denim and gray wool. She had sewn it herself, a defiant memory of another life. All around them, the scraping of forks on tin plates paused. The low murmur of conversation died. Every eye in that cold, drafty room fixed on the small counter she'd set up in the corner, a flimsy bastion of wood and pride. "No," she said. Her voice was quiet, not a shout, but it cut through the silence like a shard of glass. "You may not." Flint, the man who had spoken, let out a short, ugly laugh. His friends at the table behind him snickered. He was a big man, broad in the shoulders and narrow in the mind, his face reddened by wind and whiskey. "Now listen here," he drawled, leaning his weight onto the counter until the wood groaned. "I said, I want a taste. You're selling it, ain't you?" She finally lifted her head, and her gaze was as clear and cold as the winter sky outside. She was 18, but her eyes held the ancient stillness of a much older soul. "I am selling to those who wish to buy a full bowl. I am not giving out samples for your amusement." Flint's smile vanished. His face darkened. It was one thing to be refused. It was another to be refused by her, by the small, silent Chinese girl who'd appeared in their town a few months back, a ghost inheriting a dead man's debts and a broken-down laundry. "Don't taste my food," she said again, her words precise, each one a carefully placed stone in a wall he was not welcome to cross. He reached out a grimy hand, aiming to dip a finger into the bowl she'd just prepared for another customer. It was in that instant, as his hand moved through the air, that another hand, larger and quicker, shot out and clamped down on his wrist. The sound was a dull, solid thud. Flint froze, his eyes wide with surprise and a flicker of fear. The hand belonged to Griffin. He hadn't said a word. He'd been sitting alone in the far corner, nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee, watching. He always watched. Now he stood, unfolding his long frame from the rickety chair. He didn't look at Flint. His eyes were on Lynn, on the rigid set of her shoulders, the fierce, contained tremor in her hands. He saw the fight she was having, the one that had nothing to do with a bowl of noodles and everything to do with holding on to the last piece of herself. He gave Flint's wrist a slight, almost gentle squeeze, and the bigger man winced, his fingers uncurling. Then Griffin looked at the bowl of food, the source of all this sudden, dangerous heat. He let go of Flint and took a step closer to the counter, his gaze still holding Lynn's. He picked up the spoon from the bowl. Lynn's expression hardened, a new wall of betrayal rising in her eyes. He was just another one of them. He brought the spoon to his lips. To understand why a man would start a war over a mouthful of broth, you first have to understand what it meant to be alone in a place like Redemption Creek that winter. The cold wasn't just in the air. It was in the ground, in the bones of the houses, and in the hearts of the people. It was a poverty of warmth that went deeper than a dwindling woodpile. Lynn had arrived 3 months earlier, stepping off a dusty stagecoach into a world of gray skies and suspicious stares. She carried a single worn leather satchel and a letter informing her that she was the sole heir to her great-uncle's property, a dilapidated laundry with a leaking roof and a name, the Honest Sud, that felt like a cruel joke. Her great-uncle, a man she'd never met, had been the only other Chinese person in the entire county, and his death had left a vacuum of otherness that the town seemed determined for her to fill. They looked at her as if she were a puzzle they had no interest in solving, a piece of driftwood washed up from a foreign sea. In those first weeks, silence was her only companion. The wind howled through the cracks in her walls, a lonely and constant mourner. She worked tirelessly, scrubbing other people's dirt from their clothes for pennies, her hands raw and chapped from the lye soap and icy water. At night, exhausted and invisible, she would cook for herself. Cooking was not a chore, it was a ritual. It was the only time she was not the strange girl in the broken-down laundry. In the small, cramped room behind the shop, with the scent of ginger and star anise filling the air, she was her mother's daughter. She was the girl who had grown up in a bustling village where food was a language of love and community. Each dish was a memory, a story whispered to herself in a tongue this land did not understand. She would close her eyes and taste home, a place that felt more distant than the moon. The decision to sell her food wasn't born of ambition. It was born of desperation. The winter deepened, work at the laundry slowed to a trickle, and the small stash of money she'd arrived with was nearly gone. One evening, shivering under a thin blanket and gnawed by a hunger that was both physical and spiritual, she looked at the pot of simmering soup on her small stove. It was rich, fragrant, alive. It was the only thing of value she possessed. The next day, she cleared a small corner in the front of the laundry, set up a plank of wood on 2 barrels, and hand-painted a simple sign. Hot noodles, 5 cents. It was a terrifying act of hope in a hopeless place. The town of Redemption Creek operated on a simple, brutal economy of power, and that power had a name: Bartholomew Hemlock. Hemlock owned the saloon, the general store, and the only boarding house with a proper stove. He controlled the flow of goods, the price of flour, and the mood of the town's sheriff, a man named Brody, who understood which side his bread was buttered on. The food in Redemption Creek was a reflection of its soul, monotonous, joyless, and functional. Hemlock's saloon served a stew of questionable origin, and the general store offered salt pork, hardtack, and beans. It was fuel, nothing more. When Lynn put up her sign, she did more than offer an alternative meal. She unknowingly challenged the entire grim structure of the town. She was offering something made with care, something that spoke of a world beyond Hemlock's gritty monopoly. Her first day, no one came. People would walk by, slow down, sniff the unfamiliar, tantalizing air, and then hurry on, as if proximity to her little corner might be contagious. They'd glance at her, then at the saloon across the dusty, frozen street, and make their choice. They chose the familiar misery. The whispers started. "What's in it?" a woman muttered to another outside the general store, pulling her shawl tighter. "Dog? Cat?" The cruelty was casual, automatic. It was the town's immune system attacking a foreign body. But hunger, true hunger, can be a powerful motivator. A few days later, a young ranch hand, broke and shivering, traded his last nickel for a bowl. He ate it standing up, hunched against the cold, his eyes closing in something that looked like religious reverence. He didn't say a word to her, but he came back the next day. Then another man came, a prospector down on his luck. Then a family passing through, too poor for the saloon. They were the town's invisible people, the ones on the fringes, and they became her first customers. They didn't come for conversation. They came for the warmth, for the feeling of something good and honest filling their bellies. Lynn served them with quiet efficiency, her face a mask of neutrality. But each coin dropped into her tin box was a small victory, a tiny crack in the wall of ice that surrounded her. She was no longer just surviving. She was building something, one bowl at a time. And in a town like Redemption Creek, building anything without Hemlock's permission was an act of rebellion. The more bowls she sold, the more visible she became, and the more she became a problem that would eventually need to be solved. Griffin was not a man who belonged to the town. He belonged to the land, to the wide, silent expanse of plains and hills that stretched out west of Redemption Creek. He ran a small ranch, inherited from his father, and he ran it alone. He came into town once a week for supplies, a tall, quiet figure who moved with a purpose that discouraged idle chatter. The townspeople knew him, but they didn't know him. They knew his brand, they knew he paid his debts on time, and they knew to give him a wide berth. There was a stillness about him, a deep well of sorrow that he carried without complaint. Years ago, that well had been a home filled with laughter. He'd had a wife, Isadora. She wasn't from around there, had come from a city back east with ideas about art and music that the practical, hard-bitten folk of the territory found frivolous. They had judged her for her soft hands, her colorful dresses, her tendency to read books instead of mending fences. Griffin had loved her fiercely, but he had been young and hadn't understood the 1,000 tiny cuts of their judgment, the slow poisoning of their whispers. He'd thought his love was a strong enough shield. He was wrong. A fever took her one winter, but Griffin always believed the loneliness, the feeling of being a perennial outsider, had weakened her spirit long before the sickness took her body. He buried her on a hill overlooking the ranch, and a part of him was buried with her. Since then, he had become a keen observer of the town's casual cruelties. He saw the way they treated anyone different, anyone who didn't fit their narrow mold. So when Lynn arrived, he noticed. He saw her in the laundry, her silhouette moving behind the steamy window late into the night. He saw the way she walked through town, her back straight, her gaze fixed ahead, refusing to flinch under the weight of their stares. He saw a familiar strength, a familiar loneliness. He recognized the quiet dignity of a soul under siege. When she started selling her food, he understood immediately what it was. It wasn't just about money. It was about creating a small patch of ground that was hers, and hers alone. He watched from his corner table in the mess hall, which was just the back room of the abandoned post office, as Flint and his cronies began their daily ritual of torment. He listened to their jeers, their crude jokes, and he watched Lynn absorb it all, her face impassive, her hands never faltering as she served the few who dared to be her customers. He was waiting. He didn't know what for, but he knew a breaking point was coming, for her and for him. He saw the shadow of his own past failure, and a cold resolve began to settle in his gut. Not again. Not on his watch. And so we return to that moment, frozen in the thick, tense air of the hall. The spoon is in Griffin's hand. Flint is standing back, rubbing his wrist, his face a thunderous mask of humiliation and rage. The other men are silent, watching, their alliances shifting with every tick of the clock. To them, this is about a cowboy putting a bully in his place. But for Griffin and Lynn, the air is charged with something far more potent. He looks at her, and the betrayal in her eyes stings him more than any physical blow could. She believes he is about to join the chorus of her tormentors, to mock the one thing she has left by tasting it and spitting it out, confirming the town's verdict that it is foreign and therefore worthless. He sees her brace for the impact, the subtle tightening of her jaw, the way she holds her breath. It is the look of someone who has been struck so many times that they no longer flinch. They simply endure. The narrator in your head, the one that whispers all your worst fears, would be screaming. He's going to humiliate you. He's going to prove them right. And maybe that's what she heard. But Griffin didn't lower the spoon. He wasn't tasting it for them. He was tasting it for her. He was crossing the line, not to violate her space, but to enter it. It was a clumsy, wordless question. Show me. Let me understand. He took the bite. The warmth of the broth bloomed on his tongue first, chasing away the room's chill. Then came the flavors. It was complex, a world away from the bland, greasy fare of the saloon. There was the savory depth of long-simmered bone, the heat of ginger, the earthy notes of mushrooms he hadn't tasted in years, and something else, a faint, floral spice that was entirely new, something that spoke of sun-drenched lands and distant shores. It tasted of care. It tasted of memory. It tasted like a story. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, and in that darkness, he didn't see a Chinese girl in a red dress. He saw a woman standing her ground against a whole world of bleakness, armed with nothing but a ladle and a pot. He saw the same defiant spark he had once loved and failed to protect in his wife Isadora. He lowered the spoon, the soft clink against the ceramic bowl the only sound in the room. He opened his eyes and looked directly at Lynn. The hardness in her gaze had not softened, but beneath it there was a flicker of confusion, of suspense. He then turned his head slowly, his gaze sweeping over Flint, over the silent tables, and landing on the mess hall proprietor who was watching nervously from the doorway. Griffin's voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it carried the weight of absolute conviction. "This," he said, his voice clear and steady, "is the best food in this territory. I'll have a bowl." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a silver dollar, and placed it on the counter. It was 20 times the price. It wasn't payment. It was a statement, a line drawn in the sand. Flint slunk away, his cronies trailing behind like defeated dogs, but the silence he left behind was heavier, more dangerous. Griffin's declaration hadn't ended the conflict. It had merely elevated it. He had taken a private humiliation and turned it into a public challenge. By declaring Lynn's food the best in the territory, he had implicitly declared Hemlock's saloon food to be second-rate. In Redemption Creek, that was akin to treason. Word traveled fast, carried on whispers from the mess hall to the general store, and finally to the swinging doors of the saloon where Hemlock was counting his money. Hemlock was a man who understood power not as a force, but as a container. As long as everyone was inside his container, eating his food, buying his goods, fearing his displeasure, he was safe. Lynn and her noodles were a tiny crack in that container. Griffin's public endorsement was a hammer threatening to shatter it. Griffin ate his bowl of noodles slowly, deliberately. He was the only customer left. Lynn moved with a quiet, contained energy, cleaning her station, refusing to meet his eye. The silver dollar lay on the counter between them, a silent testament to the bomb he had just detonated. Was he her savior, or just another man who had used her to make his own point? She couldn't be sure. The air was thick with unspoken things. When he finished, he stood up. "I'll be back tomorrow," he said, not to her, but to the room, to the listening walls, to the whole town. It was a promise and a threat. True to his word, he was there the next day, and the day after. Each day he would ride into town, tie up his horse, and walk to the dilapidated laundry. He would take a seat at the single, wobbly table he had dragged over for himself, and wait. Lynn would serve him a bowl, and he would eat. Sometimes other people came, the same fringe dwellers as before, but now they seemed to take courage from Griffin's presence. They sat a little straighter. The atmosphere was still tense, but it was the tension of a standoff, not a surrender. Hemlock did not take the challenge lying down. He was too smart for an open confrontation with a man like Griffin. Instead, he began to squeeze. The price of firewood at the general store doubled, but only for Lynn. The man who delivered fresh water from the well suddenly claimed his barrel was broken. Sheriff Brody paid her a visit, tipping his hat with a false pleasantry. "Just making sure everything's up to code, ma'am," he'd said, his eyes scanning her clean but humble setup. "Wouldn't want anyone getting sick from exotic ingredients." It was a campaign of 1,000 cuts, the same kind that had bled the life from Isadora. Every day was a new trial, a new obstacle designed to wear her down, to make it impossible for her to continue. Through it all, Griffin sat at his table, a silent, unmovable sentinel. His presence was a shield, but Lynn knew shields could break. She grew thinner, the circles under her eyes darker, but her hands remained steady, and the food she served never lost its flavor, its story. One afternoon, the cold was so bitter it felt like a physical weight. A frost had painted intricate, cruel patterns on the laundry's window. No one else had braved the cold. It was just Griffin, sitting at his table, and Lynn, moving in the small space behind her counter. The silence between them had, over the days, changed its character. It was no longer the silence of strangers, but the weighted silence of two people sharing a trench. He had finished his meal, but he made no move to leave. The warmth from the bowl lingered in his hands. "My wife," he began, his voice low, rough with disuse. "She used to say that a person's hands tell their truest story." Lynn stopped wiping the counter and looked at her own hands. They were red, chapped, with faint scars from burns and cuts. They were the hands of a worker, a survivor. She said nothing. "She was a painter," Griffin continued, his gaze lost somewhere in the frosted glass. "Her hands were always smudged with color, blues, reds, yellows. Even when she was just holding a coffee cup, you could see the ghost of a sunset on her thumb." He paused, the memory settling in the quiet room. "The people here, they saw the paint, and they thought it was dirt. They thought she was frivolous, unserious. They never understood that for her, painting was as necessary as breathing." Lynn finally turned to face him fully, her guard down for the first time. She saw the deep lines of grief etched around his eyes, the profound loneliness that mirrored her own. She understood now that his defense of her was not charity. It was an act of memory, an echo of a battle he had already lost once before. "What is in the broth?" he asked, his voice gentle. It was the first time anyone had asked with genuine curiosity, not suspicion. She hesitated, then found her voice. "Ginger," she said softly, "for warmth. And dried mushrooms my mother sent from home. She said they hold the taste of the earth after a rain." She looked at the small, precious stash of spices she kept in a locked wooden box. "And star anise, it smells like home." He nodded slowly, a deep understanding passing between them that had nothing to do with words. In that moment, he wasn't just a customer, and she wasn't just a cook. They were two people who understood the language of loss, the importance of holding on to the things that give life flavor in a world that prefers everything bland. He was seeing her, truly seeing her for the first time, and in his weary, grief-stricken eyes, she saw a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a very long time, the possibility of not being entirely alone. The fragile beginning of trust started to take root in the frozen soil of Redemption Creek. The breaking point arrived, as it always does, not with a roar, but with the quiet scrape of official leather on a wooden floor. A week after Griffin began his daily vigil, Hemlock made his move. He arrived not with his usual thugs, but with Sheriff Brody at his side. The sheriff looked uncomfortable, his gaze darting everywhere but at Lynn or Griffin. Hemlock, however, was a portrait of smug righteousness. He held a rolled-up piece of paper in his hand like a scepter. Several townspeople, drawn by the scent of a public execution, gathered outside the door, their faces pale blurs against the gray afternoon. "Miss," Hemlock began, his voice oozing a false politeness that was more insulting than any slur, "I'm afraid we have a problem." Griffin, who had been halfway through his bowl, slowly placed his spoon down. He didn't stand. Not yet. He remained seated, a coiled spring of potential energy. Lynn wiped her hands on her apron, her face a pale, determined mask. She stood her ground behind her counter, her small frame radiating a dignity that infuriated Hemlock. Sheriff Brody has been made aware of a town ordinance, Hemlock continued, tapping the paper. Ordinance 7, concerning the sale of prepared foodstuffs. It requires a commercial license, a kitchen inspection, and a fee. A rather substantial fee. He smiled, a predator's grimace. As you are operating out of a private residence and have paid no such fee, I'm afraid your business is illegal. You'll have to shut it down. Immediately. Sheriff Brody cleared his throat. It's the law, ma'am, he mumbled, his eyes fixed on a crack in the floorboards. This was the final, public humiliation. It wasn't about an ordinance, it was about power. It was about reminding her and the entire town of her place. She was to be erased, her small corner of defiance wiped clean. The crowd outside pressed closer, hungry for the drama. Lynn's shoulders slumped, just for a second, the weight of this final, insurmountable obstacle pressing down on her. All that work, all that quiet fighting, undone by a piece of paper and a man's petty malice. It was in that moment of her near surrender that Griffin finally moved. He pushed his chair back and rose to his full height, filling the small space with a sudden, imposing presence. He looked past Hemlock, past the shuffling sheriff, and his eyes met Lynn's. He saw the exhaustion, the fight finally draining out of her. He saw the precipice. Then he did something no one could have predicted. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't raise his voice. He simply spoke, his words cutting through the tension with shocking clarity. You can't shut this place down, he said. He paused, letting the statement hang in the air. Hemlock opened his mouth to retort, but Griffin continued, his gaze never leaving Lynn's. This is my wife's business. The silence that fell was absolute. It was deeper than the hush that had fallen when he'd first tasted her food. It was a silence born of pure, unadulterated shock. The crowd outside froze. Sheriff Brody's head snapped up, his jaw slack. Hemlock's smug expression dissolved into baffled disbelief. The word hung in the air, electric and impossible. Wife. Griffin didn't waver. He held Lynn's gaze, and in his eyes she saw not a hint of trickery or madness. She saw a lifeline, a crazy, desperate, unthinkable lifeline. It wasn't a declaration of love. It was a declaration of alliance. It was a strategic masterstroke, transforming a legal problem into a social one. A man had the right to provide for his wife. A husband's business was a family business. He was taking her under the protection of his name, his standing, his unassailable reputation as a man who was not to be trifled with. He was building a fortress around her with a single word. He took a step toward her, closing the small distance between them. The world seemed to shrink until it was just the two of them, standing in the eye of the storm. He lowered his voice so only she could hear it, a low, urgent murmur. Say yes, Lynn. Let me do this. It was a plea, not a command. He was offering her a shield, but he would not force her to take it. The choice was still hers. She looked from his earnest, steady eyes to the stunned face of Hemlock, and then to the curious, hungry faces of the townspeople peering through the window. She had fought for her independence, for her own small space. Now he was offering her a shared one. It felt like a surrender, but it also felt like the only way to win. She saw the truth of his offer. It was a partnership born not of passion, but of mutual respect and a shared enemy. It was a business arrangement for survival, sealed in the most public way imaginable. She thought of the cold nights, the whispers, the constant grinding effort of being alone. And then she looked at him, this quiet, sad man who saw the story in her food and the fight in her spirit. She gave a single sharp nod. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her voice, when she spoke, was clear. Yes. Griffin turned back to the dumbfounded duo. "As I said," he announced, his voice ringing with newfound authority, "this is my wife's establishment. If you have a problem with her business, Sheriff, you have a problem with me. Bring your ordinances to my ranch. We can discuss them there." He then looked at Lynn again, a question in his eyes this time, softer, more personal. He reached across the counter and took her hand. Her small, chapped hand was lost in his large, calloused one. "Lynn," he said, his voice now gentle but firm enough for all to hear, "marry me. Today." The wedding took place an hour later in the dusty, cold office of the circuit preacher, a tired man named Father Michael who had seen enough of life's strange turns to not be surprised by much. There were no flowers, no music, no well-wishers. The only witnesses were the shafts of pale winter light slanting through the grimy window, and a God who was likely as astonished as anyone else. Griffin stood tall and solemn in his dusty ranch clothes. Lynn stood beside him in her dark red dress, a splash of defiant life in the colorless room. She felt strangely calm, as if she were watching a play about two other people. When the preacher asked them to say their vows, they spoke the words in low, steady voices. They were not the promises of starry-eyed lovers, but the stark, simple oaths of two soldiers agreeing to watch each other's backs. When it was over, Father Michael sighed, signed the paper that made it all legal, and offered them a weary smile. "Good luck to you both," he said, and it sounded more like a prayer than a pleasantry. They walked out into the biting wind, husband and wife. Hemlock was nowhere to be seen. He had been outmaneuvered, his public power play collapsing into a private, impotent rage. The townspeople who saw them walk from the preacher's office to the laundry averted their eyes, whispering amongst themselves. The story was already taking root, growing into a legend they would tell for years. But for Lynn and Griffin, it was not a legend. It was a quiet, terrifying, and hopeful reality. They didn't speak on the short walk. There were no words for what had just happened. Back inside the laundry, the air was still scented with ginger and broth. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. He was no longer a customer. This was no longer just her space. Griffin looked around the small, sparse room, at the counter, at the single pot on the stove. I should go check on my stock," he said, the unfamiliar domesticity of the situation making him awkward. "I'll be back in the evening." She simply nodded. He left, and she was alone again, but the silence felt different. It was no longer the silence of abandonment, but the silence of anticipation. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. She cleaned. She prepared the ingredients for the evening's broth. The rhythm of the work was a comfort, a familiar shore in a sea of uncertainty. As dusk settled, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and cold orange, she heard the sound of his boots on the wooden porch. He entered, bringing a gust of cold air with him, and stood for a moment in the doorway. He looked tired. The weight of the day settled on his shoulders. He walked over to the small table, his table, and sat down. For a moment, they just looked at each other across the room. Then Lynn turned to the stove, ladled a steaming bowl of noodles, and carried it over to him. She placed it on the table before him. He picked up his spoon. She pulled up a chair and, for the first time, sat down across from him. The marriage hadn't been a grand romance. It was a fortress for two, built in a day, designed to keep the winter out. But as he took the first bite, and a small, genuine smile touched his lips, she felt the first fragile warmth of a foundation being laid, a quiet hope that perhaps, within these walls, something more than just survival might have a chance to grow.